Good morning. Today is March 3rd, and I'm sure you've been inundated with the Oscars and world affairs, etc. Let me try today to talk about what's going on in the world with a little analysis and hopefully not repeating too much of what you've already heard. Uh, and I do want to talk about the United States, Europe, Ukraine, Russia, and all of that. But before I do so, let me just alert you that also stuff is going on in the Middle East. Uh, Israel and Gaza Hamas were supposed to go to the second phase of the negotiations that had been agreed upon. And Israel has decided they don't want to go ahead with that right now and that they just want to continue to operate in phase one. And Hamas is very unhappy about that and says no, they want to stick to the schedule. And so now Israel has banned the arrival of food again. And so we're confronting a major mess. And of course, for the Gazans, more food shortages or starvation, etc. Anyway, that is that, and we can get back to that some other time. Now, let me start not with what happened in the last few days, but rather what happened in the General Assembly about a week ago, where there was a resolution on the third anniversary of the Ukraine war, which condemned the invasion of the Ukraine. And there was a vote, and the majority of all members of the General Assembly voted for the resolution, and there were a few states that did not. The United States joined Russia, North Korea, and Iran, and several small African states, etc., which are aligned with uh, Russia more or less because they get aid and they've had military involvement with the Russians. Uh, so here we are in a situation in which, for the first time in 70 years, the US has a lot, or even if you want a closer time since the end of the Cold War, that the US has aligned itself with Russia on something of major world event like Ukraine. And at that particular point, every reasonable analyst pointed out that we've come to the end of the post World War II period. In other words, the end of 70 years in which the United States and the West stood together and identified aggression that might have been taking place in various parts of the world. And typically does not vote with Russia, right? And has tolerated for years Russian vetoes in the Security Council, and so forth and so on. So, this is how it sort of started. Uh, then we got to the point of the situation in Ukraine deteriorating. And I want to emphasize something which I haven't seen emphasized too much on TV news and stuff, that the situation in the Ukraine war is not just deteriorating in the Ukraine, but also for Russia. And the Russian economy is in really bad shape. So Russia really has an interest in getting some help in its situation in fighting in Ukraine. The Ukraine, on the other hand, has difficulty finding more and more recruits. Lots of them have been, lots of Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. Many of them have been maimed in one fashion or another. In fact, some of the soldiers that have lost limbs are now back at the front trying to help and to fight. And in addition, the Russians have stepped up the bombardment on cities and other places in the Ukraine. uh, so that even more schools, hospitals, energy sources, electric plants, and so forth are being bombed. In fact, they've really escalated the amount of those activities the Russians have in the last 3 or 4 days. So that both the Ukrainians and the Russians have an incentive to want to stop this war. But the Ukrainians have an incentive to wanting to stop the war in such a way that they can reclaim their country. They're a sovereign country. In fact, in landmass, they're the largest country in Europe, other than Russia. And Ukraine is also a reasonably populous country. I mean, it's got about 35, 36 million people there. Russia, of course, has 148 or so. But there's some other European countries. For example, Spain has 48 million population, France 68, Germany 84, Italy 59. So you can see that there are other countries with estimable populations, but the Ukrainians with are not, some small pokey little country, either in population or the landmass. So now you have the US supporting Russia as not having invaded Ukraine, which they patently have, and then at the General Assembly, and then you have uh, some European heads of state, but also Zelensky coming right to meet with Trump, and you've probably seen a fair amount of what happened there, a fiasco and a shouting match, and the dressing down of Zelensky. Trump told me he's not playing any cards. He simply has to do what the United States wants him to do. What was at stake, you no doubt know, is that the US wants 50% of the rare earth metals that are in the soil in Ukraine. And Ukraine says, well, you can have those provided we have security that Russia restores Ukraine to its sovereign borders. So Ukraine was a sovereign state. So the fiasco led, as you know, to insults. I mean, everything from the petty, like why wasn't he wearing a suit? Well, he's been wearing this sort of military type colors outfit throughout the war, and he pointed out that he was going to wear a suit once the conflict in Ukraine was over. And he was, I'm sure you watched this, and therefore I won't detail it, was on all the newscasts. He was yelled at, screamed at, and as the newspapers point out, he didn't necessarily handle himself well. Sometimes he wanted, to speak or address to things that had been said and said they were inaccurate. Other times, either Vice President Vance or Trump shut him up. He obviously got rattled. And one of the things that hasn't been commented on all that much is that, English is a second language. And so it is very difficult to express yourself with the accuracy in a language which you sort of can speak, but it's very much a second language. So that also didn't help Zelensky. In any event, the end of this fiasco was that Europe decided they better step up and need to help. Now, this is, in general speaking, a good thing. Uh, I think both the Biden and the Trump administration are quite correct in saying that the European individual countries aren't contributing as much to NATO in any event as they might, for example, at least 2% or more. On the other hand, the figures of how much the US has spent on this Ukrainian war that has been given by the Trump administration has been totally inaccurate. First, he said $500 billion, totally wrong. Then he said 300 something billion dollars. And in point of fact, it's 106 or $10 billion. So it's considerably less. And furthermore, he's also pointed out that Europe hasn't really contributed its share because he looks at the percentage of the budgets that are contributed. But Europe as a whole has actually contributed slightly more, maybe 30 or $40 billion more than the US throughout this conflict. So we as Americans have been fed a lot of misinformation about how extraordinary our support has been. In many ways, of course, it has been very helpful, extraordinary. But in terms of the figures that we've been fed, they've been largely inaccurate and they constantly seem to be changing. In any event, there is Europe and there is individual Europes, the European Union and so forth, and of course there is NATO. And it is quite true that over the years, the US has been the main contributor to NATO. The NATO countries also incorporated most of Eastern Europe after the end of the Cold War. And Canada is also a member of NATO, though, of course, Trump says they should become the 21st, not 21st, sorry, 51st state, and we're just going to kind of annex Canada. I think this is not about to happen. Canada, too, is a sovereign state. Uh, but the Europeans got into the act very quickly. And interestingly enough, the person who sort of led and organized the meeting of the weekend was the Prime Minister of the UK. And they are members of NATO, but of course not members of the European Union. So the it's unclear, and I don't want to bore you with the details as to where each of the organization fits into the scheme of things. What most of the Europeans agreed to do was to step up military or possible military contributions to Ukraine during the conflict, especially if the US, which Trump has threatened, pulls out. Now, that sounds better than it actually is, because in point of fact, um, the all the military that all the European countries have are very weak. Uh, in some cases, training has been outdated. They very often don't have equipment. And so, if one is Russia, one looks at this and says, yeah, well, the Europeans, if they dare get involved, we're going to have World War III. And at the same time, while for leverage reasons and political reasons, the Europeans stepping up right now is, not necessarily a viable alternative to the United States. So then where are we? We are stuck in a situation where Europe, which is a good thing, is getting very much more serious about having to get some involvement and lending a hand, if it can, to the conflict, especially if Trump pulls out or largely pulls out the United States, which is still possible. And the Europeans aren't just sort of, outgoing, trying to be helpful. They have a real stake in this because some of the European countries, like the Balkans, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, uh, Putin has in the past said he might take them over again. So they're real threats because the idea that Putin has is that he wants to go back to the Cold War period and reclaim all the things that Russia controlled, Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, of course. And those countries then became sovereign, independent countries. Most of them joined the EU by now. So there is the danger for Europe, not that he's necessarily going to march into France or Spain, but rather that if he becomes victorious and takes over the Ukraine and annexes the whole Ukraine, may just be the first step in terms of the Russian ambitions to move forward. So the Europeans are really quite scared and, of course, terribly concerned about the Trump administration's possibility of pulling out or pulling back. In the meantime, there is Russia. And in the meantime, you probably know that the Trump administration seems to be rather enamored with Russia. And much of what they have been saying recently has been essentially what Russia has been saying, and somewhat hidden because there is so much discussion about the Ukraine and military things, is the fact that the US, in fact, now has been in discussion with the Russians for economic assistance. Russia really, really needs some economic help and investments and needs the freeing off up of, the locked in agreements that have gone away for them in terms of trade and so forth. So Russia and the United States now look from the perspective of Europeans and certainly Ukrainians and even any kind of American analyst critical of the current Trump administration policy, as if, you know, our ally is now Russia. It is no longer certainly Ukraine and not even particularly Europe, right? So the world, according to this plan, will be Russia, United States, and China vying internationally and cutting up the world, and everybody else can just, pull back and live under whatever auspices they're going to have to live with, whether it's Russian or American or Chinese and so forth. In the meantime, of course, what the Chinese are doing is looking at all of this, aside from giving help and North Korea giving help to the Ukraine, is saying to themselves, well, if the United States is not going to defend Ukraine, they're certainly not going to defend Taiwan. So actually, this helps us free us up that in the next few years we can retake Taiwan without much interference by the United States. In other words, the United States won't step up for the autonomy of Taiwan. So, on the one hand, while most of this is playing itself out in terms of the Ukraine and the Russians and the United States, what is happening simultaneously is that other people, for example, the Chinese, are saying, okay, we're now living in a new world order. And most analysts, even in the West, think we're now living in a new world order, and I agree with that. And we will not, even if Trump, let's say, has 4 years and then the Democrats come in, it will take a decade or more to put this genie back in the bottle. There's no quick fix to what has just happened. What has just happened is that 70 years of a post-World War II structure has become not just frayed a little, but has become essentially disentangled. And yes, there is NATO, and you could say, well, the US is part of NATO, and NATO is the military arm that is going to protect Europe and all the rest of it. But don't forget what makes NATO so powerful is that its Clause 5 says one against all. So the only time that NATO has gone into imagining that they were getting into a conflict was for us in 9/11. NATO was prepared to help us when 9/11 happened, right? Because it was unknown how this happened, who was involved, and so forth. Other than that, NATO has never had to be activated in terms of someone getting attacked and then everybody getting involved. The reason, of course, that that's so powerful is that, all of NATO together, including the United States, has a lot of leverage to deter conflicts and also to manage them if they occur. So yes, there's still NATO, and indeed, Zelensky and Ukraine would love to join NATO, and that's not politically possible at the point because of Russia and the United States and all the rest. But the real concern in Europe right now is that the one against all aspects of NATO will no longer be honored by the United States either. That is to say, Trump administration has said they'll stay in NATO, but they don't particularly believe in this clause 5, one against all. And that means that even the prospect of NATO as the largest post World War II alliance with real teeth in it, if some conflict broke out, is also potentially semi disabled. Because the amount of arms and economic well being and leverage of all the countries of NATO together are not up to the task under certain circumstances without the United States, because the US is the biggest military contributor and most important deterrent country in NATO, right? Because when you say the US will get involved, you're talking serious business in terms of its economic and military capacity. And if a country can't is reasonably sure that they can attack somebody and the US won't get involved, it essentially undermines the cause of NATO. So what has happened in the last few days is not only that the US has gone to bed with Russia and the US has diminished the stature of Zelensky and the Ukrainians in some ways, and all that the Ukrainians are asking for right now is yes, yes, you can have our rare earth minerals, but we have to have some security. And the security they need is, the United States saying that unless there is a ceasefire which is monitored and can be sure that Russia is not going to move, it's too risky, which is why they keep saying some security needs to be provided. And the US says, we're not going to provide security. And the Europeans say, yes, we would be happy to try to provide security. And then, of course, the Russians say, well, they're not very capable anyway. And if they're going to provide security, we won't even have a ceasefire. Or if we have a ceasefire, we can still capture more territory. It is at the moment a monumental mess. And the mess is not just what this conference does and that conference does, and you may not want to keep up on all of these details, but the mess is that we are now living in a new world order. And a new world order in which the US is playing a very different role. And even though we've had uh, some bad policies, the Vietnam War, the Iraqi War, and all the rest. Essentially, the US and its military and economic might was a deterrent for countries to mind their P's and Q's. And that has come to an end because every analyst, especially people who are located in Russia and so forth, essentially says, yes, the Russians need help, economic help, and they'd love to have the end of the Ukraine war. But the last thing they will do is give up the idea that the Ukraine is part of sovereign Russia. They want it back, right? So if there is a tentative agreement or even an agreement of a ceasefire, and the ceasefire has no teeth in it, that is to say, there's no deterrent built in for the Russians to not move further or to continue to bombard, then the whole thing falls apart, right? So everybody at this point is pulling their teeth saying, what the hell are the Americans doing going into bed with the Russians? The Trump administration is saying, we we're in good terms with Putin. We have, Putin's back. Yes, we'll negotiate with this disgusting Zelensky, whom we don't like and who doesn't wear suits to the right occasions. We think he should step down. Let's have somebody else. Let's have chaos in the Ukraine. Maybe that will make it easier, for the Russians to do whatever they want to do. And the Russians are saying, we're not moving back, or we're not moving. If anything, we're going to move forward. and the Ukrainians are worn down. They need more help, and they need more help quickly. The Europeans say this is of central interest to us, even if it's not central interest to the United States, and we want to step up. And the fact that they're going to step up and rearm and so forth is altogether a good thing. But if you're asking me for my opinion, it's a little too late and certainly too little in the short term. In the long term, this might be a good way to protect Europe or to deter more aggression in Europe, to protect the Balkans, etc. So I'm not saying the Europeans waking up and saying we need to stand up and we need to donate more to our military forces, we need to train them up, we need arms, and so forth and so on. The Europeans in the last few days have also said, okay, well, if the Americans aren't shipping the arms to Ukraine that they need. By the way, the Trump administration has held up the last Biden administration increment of military capacity that the Ukrainians were promised. So they even holding up what they had already been promised. And so they're running short on everything, and they're getting, attacked right, left, and center. Uh, can some kind of negotiated ceasefire be had? Probably. That negotiation would probably mean the United States does Russia a lot of economic favors, which they need in some ways. It's a porous ceasefire. And the Russians probably will imagine that the security that whatever the US finally agrees to provide for the ceasefire is not very strong and can be overcome. And minimally, they don't have to pull back, but maximally, the time will come again when they can forge ahead. Day by day, I mean the Russians, because as far as they're concerned, Ukraine is a central part of Russia. They don't accept it as a sovereign state. The history of Russia and the Ukraine is very complicated. Over history, that whole part of the world, borders kept changing and so on and so forth. But most historians will point out there is such a thing as Ukraine, there is a Ukrainian language, there's a Ukrainian history, and they were promised at the end of the Cold War an independent Ukraine. And in fact, they gave up something which is often forgotten. The nuclear capacity, military nuclear capacity for Russia was heavily situated in the Ukraine. And the Ukrainians agreed to transfer all that nuclear capacity, in other words, to denuclearize militarily. They have nuclear energy capacity, but to denuclearize militarily for the agreement and the borders and reclaiming their own country and getting rid of the Russians. Excuse me. So they actually gave up a lot for what they thought was going to be the security of the future. Now, I don't think that they will engage in a either temporary ceasefire or a permanent solution. That is nothing more than the United States being able to mine things out of the soil, and we get some benefit out of it, but they continue to be insecure. I am not genius enough to figure out, or not genius at all, to figure out how this is going to come out in the next few weeks. But it is a very rocky road, and what it has done is not just created a very difficult to resolve mess for any kind of peacekeeping security for the Ukraine, but what I want to emphasize is even larger than that, which I mentioned up front, and that is the role of the US in world affairs as the biggest power in the world, the most influential for all countries who are democratic or at least not seriously authoritarian, the most admired country in many ways for its democracy and for its institutions and so forth, has lasted with some flaws, admittedly, but has lasted for 70 years and it has all gone away and it cannot be recaptured. So even in 4 years, if people start wanting to go put the genie back in the bottle again, I'm afraid the genie can't be put back in the bottle again. You might have a new world order, you might have a more positive and less self-focused role of the United States, etc., etc. And in the process of the U.S. failing to be the country that people got used to being is, of course, not just the Ukrainian situation, but the situation of US pulling out of the World Health Organization, destroying USAID. As we speak, people are dying of AIDS again in Africa. Ebola is spreading, a new virus is spreading. The World Health Organization doesn't have the resources to deal with all of this. In other words, even in obscure places around the world, the damage that the US has done to its reputation is not just its seeming new alignment with Russia, but its positive and welcomed role in world affairs. And that is going to be very difficult to restore. And I guess we are all going to have to live out most of our lives living in a country which is no longer either the dominant country in the world, but certainly not respected and admired anymore. And this for us all is not just troubling in terms of feeling sorry for people elsewhere and maybe people in the United States who are losing their jobs as well, but is a tragedy of historic proportions. And historians will write many books about when US hegemony in terms of power, if you will, but US role and by and large positive role of building international law, building international institutions, and on the whole, with some blips, as I said, Vietnam, Iraq, and so forth, on the whole, being what kept the democratic and institutions as well as the networks of institutions built to maintain the international system. That has all been blown up in what, 6 weeks by our current president. It's very sad, but we need to keep ourselves informed. It seems to me that's the least we can do. Sorry to end on such a negative vote. See you in 2 weeks.